Welcome back to another episode of Consciously Clueless. I'm your host, Carly, and here we break down complex issues around health, the climate crisis, and social justice through a vegan lens. We'll talk about the magic link between your well being and the planet's health because luckily, choosing a healthier, mindful lifestyle for yourself often creates healthier vibes for our planet too. Staying consciously clueless means getting to show up knowing nothing, but staying open to all that you can learn. From feasting on plant-based meals and reducing waste to learning to meditate, every step you take contributes to your wellness and makes systematic change for the world. You can make a difference. This podcast will show you how. Hello, Consciously Clueless listeners. I am excited and honored, honestly, to bring you something a little bit different for this month's solo episode. And it's going to be a little different because it won't be solo. You will remember my guest, Calen Otto, if you've listened to episodes past. Calen is not only a fellow podcast host, they host the Unruly podcast, but also has become a dear friend. It is one of those examples of how social media can really be connecting and beautiful and find you your people. Earlier this month, Calen wrote an essay titled "Yes, I'm Okay After Hurricane Helene Hit North Carolina, but Not Really." In a podcast episode, Calen talked about the hurricane and read their essay. As soon as I heard it, I knew that I needed to share it with Consciously Clueless listeners because I had been looking for ways to talk about the hurricane, to talk about these disasters and climate change and speciesism and all of the above, all of the things we get into here on the podcast. And Calen so beautifully explained all those intersections in this essay and in this episode. So today's solo episode on this podcast will be partly a playing of Calen reading their essay about Hurricane Helene. I was also lucky enough to ask Calen a few questions about not only sharing this experience with the world, but with things we can do and how they're feeling and taking care of themselves. Let's get into it. Next, we're going to hear from Calen as they read their essay about Hurricane Helene and how they're doing. And at the end of the episode, there will be some follow-up questions that I was able to ask Calen to hear about how they're doing, how to move the needle in these conversations, how they're taking care of themselves, and more. As some of you may know, I live in North Carolina and was in the path of Hurricane Helene, so today's episode is going to be a little bit different. While I am super lucky to be able to say that I am alive and okay, so many others cannot say the same. So I'm recording this episode on October 17th, but on September 25th was when the hurricane really picked up. And to this day, there are still thousands and thousands of people in Asheville and surrounding towns that don't have power, don't have service, and don't know if their loved ones are okay. So it is a pretty devastating situation. And within the first few days after the hurricane hit, I processed most things by writing them. I sat down and wrote this essay, which I'll be reading in today's episode. Not only is this a timestamp for what happened here in my community, but I think that this essay speaks to larger issues that everyone everywhere will probably experience at some point, though I wish that wasn't the case. In this essay, we'll investigate the intersections of Helene, anti-speciesism, wildness, climate change, and more. Now, this is also a written post on my website, so if you click the link in the show notes, you can always follow along and also see the photos. And in this essay, I'll be referencing some of the animal rights work I did in 2018 when Hurricane Florence hit North Carolina. So if you want to go back and listen to that story first, I'm going to update it, and it's episode number 24 of the Unruly podcast called My Modern Love Story, Heartbreak in a Hurricane. Now, before we get into it, I know that many of you who live outside of these impacted areas really want to help. And while there are so many collective shifts that are needed, there are things that you can do right now. I'll go over many of them in today's episode, so please take those seriously.
But if you want to donate, I beg of you to please donate to local mutual aid organizations. The government, I promise you, does not need any more of your money, but these grassroots organizations who care for their community every single day of the year really know their people best and can make the most out of it. So, with that being said, I'll put a link in the show notes of trusted organizations that I know of personally that you can donate to. You can share with your friends if you know that they're wanting to help as well. Right off the bat, up there on the top of the list when it comes to people doing human aid, you have beloved Asheville and the Pansy Collective. And then there are also people doing work for non human animals who are often forgot about in these situations, such as Ziggy's Refuge, who is coordinating fundraising and relief efforts for all of the sanctuaries in this area because there are so many of them. And then you have other rescues that are vegan owned, to my understanding, like Esther Neonatal Kitten Alliance and Sister Kitten Animal Rescue. Again, a list of places to donate to will be in the show notes. Second, you can share stories like what you're going to be listening to today, because while some people are easily able to access their empathy and metabolize the grief happening in situations like this, it's a lot harder for some other people. But I think that the more it's personalized for them and the more they're exposed to it, they'll be urged to investigate their place and their link to what's happening. And lastly, again, I can't help but think of reinstitutionalization, something that we talked about in episode number 75 of this podcast, because despite all of the trauma that has happened, all of the destruction, so many people who are in it, who are still in it to this day, have checked in on us. And it really solidifies for me that those in person connections and webs that you weave of community are so important. There's people checking in from my softball team that's newly formed, and the garden community, and the animal rights community. And while Hurricane Helene was in no way, shape, or form something good that happened, there are beautiful community building aspects that have come out of this. Okay, now I will read my essay titled, Yes, I'm Okay After Hurricane Helene Hit North Carolina, but not really. If I could only choose one word to describe how I'm feeling after Hurricane Helene, a force of nature that went from a Category 1 to a Category 4 in a mere 24 hours, it would be lucky. Maybe if you know me personally, you're relieved to hear the word lucky. After the winds whipped through and tore down healthy, green, beautiful monsters of trees, whose strong, thick roots I could never imagine pulling away from the soil to topple before their time, I'm relieved to feel that way too. Although these trees crashed down on the land surrounding our home, split our woodshed in half, and turned our rugged mountain driveway into a wooded graveyard, nothing touched our house. I am well, and my partner is well. Our animal companion, Bilbo Baggins, is well. Heading: I'm not as safe as you think, and neither are you. Maybe you're tempted to stop reading because you know that we're safe. But are we really? Through my limited internet connection that I somehow, despite thousands and thousands of my neighbors not having access to still, saw a quote on Instagram from Perthshire Mags that said, Climate change will manifest as a series of disasters viewed through phones with footage that gets closer and closer to where you live until you're the one filming it. This is absolutely the case for me and countless others who dwell in and love Appalachia. Since making home around here 7 years ago, I've felt safe in the lush woods of the mountains. While others see the wild animals that burrow and roam these shared slopes as a threat, I see them as the indigenous ones, and I'm glad to know that there are any of them left. There's a footnote for the word wild, and it says, I highlight the word wild because it's starting to sound funny to me that we use it as a term to describe other animals who have thankfully evaded domestication, a sad standard of a way of being that is forcibly spread via colonization, and use it to set ourselves apart from them. Wild is something I yearn to be, something I'm working on becoming, or more accurately, something I'm getting back to. End of footnote. While others see the wilderness as a dangerous, untamed space where bad things happen, I can't express with the limited nature of the English language how much I need it for my mental health, and thus my survival. In parentheses, we are animals, and seeing and being in green spaces that have somewhat of a healthy ecosystem is crucial to our mental health and overall well being. Healthy ecosystems are equivalent to a healthy home. End parentheses. Aside from the mental health benefits of living in the mountains in a somewhat healthy ecosystem, or rather one of the healthiest left, I'm sure if I was here even 60 years ago, I would not be calling what we're left with after development and the spread of civilization healthy in any way. I feel a sense of safety here because of the abundance of natural resources. Living off grid means we get water from the mountain, wood from the forest, and food from the soil. We have water, food, heat, and shelter without having to ask anyone for it or fearing it will be cut off from us if disaster strikes and the power goes out. Over the years, I've expressed this sense of safety and remarked that I'm so glad we live here, close to Asheville, out of the reach of climate change. Since the climate emergency is something that I research, think about, and even write about for my paid job, I study the images and read the words describing the devastation to people all over the world as we supercharge what was once a natural disaster most days of the week. My heart is heavy for everyone who loses their homes, their passions, their family members, their journals, their family photographs, their communities, and even their lives. But there's only so much that I can do from my safe perch in the Appalachian Mountains. Or at least that's what I thought until I was the one watching the trees bend in half outside our home. Until I was the one filming the disaster on my own turf. Heading: North Carolina, my beautiful and toxic home. 2018 was the first time that I found myself in that position in North Carolina. A dedicated, young, and brave activist who is naive about the deadly impact that even Category 1 hurricanes have, I purposely drove myself and my comrades into the heart of the storm, which was some 277 miles away from our home base. Our goal was clear: aid and rescue as many non human animals as possible, since they're one of the last things on people's minds, while helping humans along the way. And we did just that, but horror and absolute devastation can't even begin to explain what I felt about what we witnessed. Duplin County is saturated with pig, chicken, and turkey factory farms where thousands upon thousands of animals are crammed into abusive conditions that keep them in pain, fear, and on the edge of death before they're slaughtered prematurely for human consumption. Doing animal rescue there meant seeing this ugly industry from the inside out. Because floods were coming and farmers knew that animals would die, they locked and sealed their giant CAFO buildings, factory farms, tight so that the animals inside had nowhere to go, no way to escape the rising waters. Instead, they would drown and their bodies would be counted for insurance money. The animals who did manage to escape and flee were left swimming through toxic waters, poisoned by the pollution of the factories that exploit them, without drinking water or food. And I was happy for them. Even though my exposed skin burned where water made contact with it as I waded into murky and foul smelling waters to try and coax them out, I knew that this was their only shot at freedom. While we rescued some animals and lost others, I learned firsthand the consequences of hurricanes. Heading: Wind, Water, and Wood, a two-sided, muddy coin. Wind, water, and wood. These are three things that I usually relate to with reverence, awe, joy, and necessity. But this week, I mainly related by fear. While a breeze of wind can refresh one's body and spirit on a hot day, it can also thrash a forest and plunge trees through your roof. While drops of water are to be admired on petals or soaked in when floating in a cold mountain river, multiplied, they can suck you under and leave you lifeless. While wood aids in our writing, reading, wiping, and is essential to our everyday lives, you don't know the strength or force of a tree until it is toppled onto something invaluable to you. These elements change and take on new meaning in a hurricane. Combined together at high speeds and unrelenting pressures, there's no escaping the mixer of destruction. That's what I realized in Hurricane Helene. If Hurricane Florence exposed me to how human cruelties inflicted on our beyond human kin exacerbate a once natural, now human supercharged disaster, Helene introduced me to the notion that I am not one of the safe ones. There are no safe ones. Now, this is not to take away from systemic racism and classism. Poor people, marginalized people of color, non human animals, and people fighting to get out from under the relentless weight of colonization get hit worse. They have less resources to prepare with when disaster strikes, and less aid funneled their way to begin repair afterwards, less media attention. I would even venture to say less thoughts and prayers. While I write about the devastation here in Appalachia, I can't help but think about the seemingly never ending imposed violence and death in the Congo, Palestine, the Amazon, and countless other places. There's only so much grief that a human heart can hold, and I haven't even begun to grasp the depth of it. But on some days, I think I might explode. Heading: Helene doesn't care about 300 or 2,134. Still, I am faced with this realization that even in Asheville, some 300 miles from the nearest coastline with an elevation of 2,134 feet, can and will be wiped out by hurricanes. Our death toll continues to climb as people dig through the mud, fish through the water for bodies, and realize that their loved ones are missing. Our neighborhood patriarch, who is now over 80 years old and has lived here his entire life, tells me he's never seen anything like this as he rides around on his 4x4, checking in on neighbors to see if they're okay. What the old timers once called an 100-year flood is now every few years. I wonder if they believe in human assisted global warming. As he checks in on our community, I know that the surrounding mountain communities are doing the same, checking on each other, sharing resources, sharing stories, spreading the news of what has happened to neighbors via mouth, and doing what they can to get by. I know this is a fact because not only is it happening here as I write this, but I heard this sentiment repeated over and over again as we waited in line with dozens of other people to enter the grocery store. There, we had our pick of whatever is left over before waiting in line with hundreds of other cars to stock up on gas for generators, chainsaws, and vehicles. Heading: The Generators of the Night. The vibrant quiet of the forest night was cut last night by generators never turned off, and each morning I wake to the sound of distant chainsaws doing the work of clearing the way forward. After checking in with our neighbors and stocking up on supplies, we do the same, rev up the chainsaws, and get to work on clearing the driveway. As I push, shove, and toss entire trees or tree limbs to the side, I wonder how many times I'll be repeating this process in my lifetime. Despite the fear I felt when we fled the forest at daybreak during the peak hours of the storm just a few days ago, due to the threat that we could sense as we listened to trees crash around us, I like the look of this wild landscape. I like the feeling of doing something useful and that matters with my hands. I secretly enjoy that I'm not bound to my phone, expected to reply to texts, calls, and Instagram DMs. Is it wrong to feel somewhat of a neutrality and relief when so much loss is going on around you? I guess that's a privilege of being lucky, the privilege of having resources and systems in place to help you be okay if you're still alive. By now, you've heard about so many feelings that have stirred and settled inside me during the hurricane: fear, awe, luck, helplessness, neutrality, and relief. But now I just feel anger. Heading: I'm not just mad at you, Helene. Anger at those who continue to spread the myth that human boosted climate change is imaginary, that it's something the hippies made up for attention and something to do. For years, I held up signs outside of the Smithfield slaughterhouse, one of the largest in the world at the time, begging people in Duplin County and beyond to wake up to the fact that commodifying and farming animals was not only cruel and unnecessary, but that hurting our non-human kin in this way would come back to hurt us in the end, via hurricane, flood, or mudslide. They mostly flipped me the bird or yelled at me to get a job as they drove by. If their job includes confining and abusing animals needlessly while supercharging events like Helene in the process, isn't it my job to say something? Not too long after the protest, I traveled back to the same location to wade through toxic water to check on them. Not long after that, did some of those people send money or drive my way to wade through muddy water to check on my people? The point is, we're all in this together. But who is to blame? Is it the farmers who continue to confine thousands of animals in CAFOs and leach their toxic waste into the earth? Is it the legislators who do nothing but give out passes and prizes to those who are causing toxic algae blooms and destroying our waterways? Is it the CEOs of Exxon who don't give a shit about human life or non-human life? Is it just white people? Is it the men who cemented our horrific fucking government into place? Is it me who's typing this now on it, albeit used, MacBook that was created at the expense of someone else's life in a seemingly faraway country? It's too much to unpack as I sit and write on a generator-powered computer and think about the rest of the trees that will be cleared later today, or the income I lost on the days where I didn't work. These shallow, immediate thoughts, as well as the larger looming ones, sit inside me. I feel guilty for thinking about money when people have lost their entire homes. Being human has become complicated. Heading: donate and think and pray and hope but there is one thing that I am sure of. There's only so much I can do. While you can donate and think and pray and hope and wish and volunteer and cry and check in and give and lend a hand, you can also change how you live everyday life. You can adopt a completely plant-based diet, something that Harvard researcher Joseph Poore cites as the biggest way an individual can slow climate change. It eases the burden on the natural world when you stop supporting animal agriculture, an industry that kills between 3.4 and 6.5 billion animals a day worldwide and is one of the leading causes of climate change, water pollution, deforestation, air pollution, soil degradation, and species extinction. You can invest at whatever level or pace is accessible to you in cleaner sources of energy by embracing off-grid solutions in natural buildings. You can work to reduce your reliance on food that was maintained by underpaid, undocumented workers and then shipped from one side of the United States to the other by shopping at your local farmer's market, starting a garden, or even growing familiar herbs on your windowsill. You can repair your clothes and swap with friends instead of going out and buying new. It's true. Some people don't have immediate access to these changes, or maybe they already live like this due to necessity. But there are countless others who can make these changes. And while we hear again and again that pressure to change and live more sustainable shouldn't be placed solely on individuals make up the businesses, who make up the companies, who make up the industries, who make up the laws, who make up the government. We can protest, we can lobby, and we can even try to change the system from the inside out. But after a decade of doing all these things, I haven't seen much change. I can't control the system. But I can be autonomous, to some extent, in what I do every day, the stories I tell, in the mutual aid I engage in, and how I shape my community. I can work for more self-sufficiency and keep putting pressure on the system so that it eventually crumbles. In the meantime, we need not wait for anyone's permission to start building something better with what we've got and who we know. If you ever find yourself in a hurricane while the winds whip household appliances around you and entire homes float past you on the street, you realize there's only so much one can do. And yet there's so much one can do if we're only willing to be brave enough to do it.
That essay was so powerful. I'm so thankful that Calen let me play that episode here for you Consciously Clueless listeners. I also wanted to chat with Calen a little bit more about the experience, and I wanted to know, why did they need to share this with the world? Why did they feel it was important? And after chatting with them earlier this month, Calen mentioned that they were a little nervous to release this episode, and I wanted to know more about why.
First of all, hello to everyone listening. I'm still in North Carolina. You actually might hear some noise going on in the background behind me, and from where I sit right now, I can see people literally fishing tires out of this lake. I can see people cleaning up and repairing things, and I can also see a trucked park that's either taking blood or giving out free water and food and other resources to people. So there is a lot of cleanup that is still happening. To answer your first question, why I was nervous about sharing this essay, I think that I was nervous about sharing this essay because everything felt so sensitive and still feels sensitive. You know, when you're in a disaster, and this was my second hurricane in North Carolina, sometimes you look around and you're so upset and heartbroken by all this loss and everything that's going on, but your home is completely fine or your family is completely fine. And, you know, I've heard the word survivor's guilt talked about, and while I don't think I have that, I just have a lot of empathy for the people around me who lost so much more than I did, like their homes or their lives. Yeah, I just always want to be sensitive to that when that's happening. And another thing is, when you talk about social justice issues like climate change or animal rights, people often say now's not a good time to talk about it, even when a disaster is not happening. But I think these things are very important to talk about, and even more important now because we need to call out like what is making these so-called natural disasters worse for people. We need to talk about how if we continue living the way we're living, this is going to look for people in the future. And so anytime you speak out about something like that, it can just be a little bit scary when there are so many different issues to be sensitive to. But I think it's incredibly important. And my hope is that we can learn from every disaster that comes our way, and it's enough to fuel us to change, to try to lessen the effects in the future. But I don't know. I don't know if that's going to happen.
Next, I wanted to hear from Calen and know if they thought that these last few disasters would move the needle for conversation around the climate crisis.
Do I think that the last natural disasters will move the needle when it comes to conversations around the climate crisis? I wish that I could say yes for this. I wish I could feel a little more positive and optimistic, but I'm not so sure. To me, from my vantage point, it feels like the people who get it and will be more quote-unquote radicalized by these situations, especially if they went through something like Hurricane Helene. But because of our media and news and all of these lies that have broken out around conspiracy theories, I think that the people who don't get it are going further in the opposite direction. So while I don't think it will make this huge shift, I think it will radicalize those who already care and it was already on their radar.
I knew Calen was the perfect person to ask what resources they recommended for people who wanted to learn more about this connection between our actions and the future of the world.
When it comes to resources for people who want to learn more about how our actions affect the future of the entire world, because we are all so interconnected. One, I want to start with this podcast that I'm on right now because you cover a variety of topics, whether it comes to products that we use or food. And I think it's a really accessible way for people to start learning and make immediate changes in their lives, even if it's something gradual that they're doing. Another resource that I think is really great is the website awellfedworld.org. They cover all sorts of food topics related to climate, and you hear a lot like, yes, adopt a plant-based diet, which I am right behind there telling everyone that. I want to shout it off the top of the rooftops. But A Well-Fed World has the science and the data to back it up, and they even dive really deep into subjects like, is grass-fed meat more sustainable than vegetables that were shipped across the country? And they really get into the intricacies in those food conversations, and they can steer you in the right direction. And on their website, they also have an eco food guide. So it's not that they're just giving you this information and saying good luck, but they're giving you a way to implement these changes when it comes to food in your life. And they also explain how powerful it is. The third resource that I'll put that out there is my blog and my podcast as well. We cover a lot of the same topics, but I talk about how we choose to travel, eat, what we choose to wear, the house we choose to live in. All these different things impact the future of our planet. And it's not just all doom and gloom. There's also stories and instructions on how you can make your own compost toilet, or how you can get into natural buildings, or travel on a budget in a really eco-minded way. So for folks wanting to learn more, I think that connecting with people who have just integrated these things into their everyday lives and know how to make it just an automatic thing that they do is really important, so that you can do that as well and you don't have to think twice about it.
And finally, I wanted to ask Calen one of my favorite questions to ask people. How are they taking care of themselves right now?
How am I taking care of myself right now? Well, every morning for the past few days, I've been reading a chapter in a book by Thich Nhat Hanh. It has to do with suffering and suffering well, and it's actually been really helpful for me to wake up and look at something empowering every morning, but also something simple that's just reminding you to breathe or open your eyes and be really grateful for all of the colors that you're able to see. So they're really accessible ways to feel better instantly, which I think is really helpful after disasters like this. I've also been connecting with community members in person, and I think that's been really important too, just to visually see that my friends are okay, know that we have each other's backs, and be able to talk about different things that we've gone through and plans for the future. And the last way that I'm taking care of myself is by continuing to focus on things that I'm passionate about. And when I do that, I think it helps me process a lot. For example, that's how this essay about Hurricane Helene came to be in the first place. I was writing about it to process it, and I'm passionate about the things that I'm writing about, and being able to share it with the world and hope that it makes some sort of change really feels like self-care. I'm continuing to do podcast episodes and writing and things that I hope will move the needle forward.
A huge shout out and thank you to Calen for letting me share this powerful episode with Consciously Clueless listeners. I know it is an incredible way to bring forward this conversation about Hurricane Helene and disasters and veganism and the climate and all of it. And Calen did such an amazing job of connecting all of those dots for us. Make sure to check out the show notes for this one. I will put in resources that Calen included, mutual aid places to donate, and more resources for you to learn about how to keep taking action. If you're hearing this message, you've listened to the entire episode of Consciously Clueless. And for that, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, tag me when you share on social media, or share this episode with others who may be interested in the topic. Any sharing truly means the world to me. Join the community at patreon.com/consciouslycarly for bonus podcast content like smoke sessions with Consciously Cannabis guests, video versions of solo episodes, monthly live calls, one-to-one support, more lifestyle content, mindfulness resources, and more. Until next time, stay consciously clueless.